recording. And I will let Sharnel introduce herself. And just a reminder, if you have questions as we're going through, feel free to throw those into the chat box. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
All right. Well, Kwaashk'IKwáan, thank you all for being willing to be here on your lunch break and listen to me and having interest in this topic. It's something I'm very passionate about, so I'm excited to share it all with you. Let me share my screen. As Meryl said, if you have any questions during, feel free to pop them in the chat. I prefer to answer questions as I go, but if we miss them too, we can definitely bring them up again at the end. And I lost the video, so let me see if I can pull your guys' video up. There we go. You could also, if you have your video on, you could wave at me and I'll try and pay attention to that. Okay. So today's topic, infusing Southeast traditional practices and evidence-based practice. I over-prepared in slides. I think I have 32 slides, so we might not get through it all. I have a question for you guys. Would you prefer more content or a mindfulness exercise that I have kind of planned at the end? So if you guys want to, I don't know, let's do a poll. Can you do a poll, Meryl? Do you know how to do that?
I think I would have had to set it up beforehand, unfortunately, but feel free to throw in the chat, maybe just say the word content or exercise if that works. And yeah, so you can content if you want a little more of the slides and information, exercise if you'd like to experience Sharnel walking us through the experience. Thank you.
Okay, I'm seeing more for content. So in the meantime, I'll plan on doing more content, and that works because the mindfulness is at the very end. So if we get to it, awesome. All right. A little about me. I'll do my Lingít introduction for you guys. Yaagál Yakutat Sharnel Vale-Jones, Yech Nayakatsiti, Kwaashk'IKwáan Ayakhat, Dishit Ayakhat, Dialectical Kagwan Ta Nudisagum. My Lingít name is Yaagál. My English name is Sharnel. You guys can all say Sharnel today. It's easier to say and remember. I'm from the Raven Moiety, the Kwaashk'IKwáan clan, the Moon House, and my father's clan is Tekwedi, and my grandfather's clan is Kagwan. So Kwaashk'IKwáan is a Yakutat tribe, and there's actually a Kwaashk'IKwáan member on here, Dr. Judy Ramos. She's participating today, so it's kind of fun to see another clan member here. I am currently living in Anchorage. I've been here since 2008. I came up after I graduated high school, had way too much fun in college, dropped out, and then I started working for ANTHC, the big Alaska Native Health Consortium up here. And I was with them for 9 years. During that time, they supported my education, and I got a bachelor's in counseling psychology at APU, and then immediately started attending the Clinical-Community Psychology program in 2019. So I'm in my 4th year, and I started my clinical experience in 2020, fall of 2020. So it's been about 2.5 years, or 2 years and a couple months of clinical training. I've done something in a practicum every semester since then. So this is actually my first semester not being in a practicum, and it's pretty great to have that extra 20 hours a week. But in that time, I've also been a clinical intern at Tlingit and Haida, and that's what I'll be talking a lot about today. The practices that we're going to be talking about are predominantly Tlingit, and that's because I'm Tlingit and I had access to Tlingit cultural bearers to interview when we were trying to infuse some of our evidence-based practice into the group therapies and individual therapy that we do. So that's why, but we love for participants to tell us about Haida, Tsimshian, or any other cultures that they belong to, even outside of indigeneity. So yeah, I've been with CBS Healing Center, Tlingit and Haida CBS Healing Center since September of 2021. I purposely included a picture of my kids here because I always forget to talk about that I have a family during introductions, but I am married and I have 2 kids, and here's us this year. Well, I guess 2022 celebration in Juneau. We try to go every year. My kids love it. My daughter actually just recently sang to her classroom up here on Elizabeth Bradovich Day, and it was just like, I don't know, it made me tear up. It was so cute, and I just love seeing you know, the younger generation engaging in cultural practices. All right, I'm just going to move on now. Today, we're going to talk about just real briefly some multicultural trans-theoretical models out there. My experience so far at the Healing Center, we're going to do the mindfulness activity if there's time, have some resources at the end, and some time for questions. All right, so multicultural models, why is it important? There's been numerous studies that have shown when you don't incorporate cultural factors or ethnicity into mental health, it can be harmful. And when you do, it can be really protective. And so cultural sensitivity towards client expectations, attributions, values, beliefs are always something that is going to help you build rapport with the client, you know, which is, you know, supposed to be 60% of therapeutic outcomes, but also just is more likely for the person to want to come to therapy, to have more meaningful engagement in therapy. And then there was actually a study with dialectical behavior therapy and adolescent American Indian Alaska Native populations that did show that there was an improvement in mood symptoms with traditional cultural and spiritual practices incorporated into DBT. So I have those references at the end for those 2 citations, if you feel like you want to read those articles. All right, so the 2 trans-theoretical models that I just want to briefly talk about is the cross-cultural counseling competencies conceptual framework. And I like this one because of how simple it is, as far as like, you know, there's not a whole lot of like lines going here and there and connecting them, but there's just 3 main constructs: awareness, knowledge, and skills. And so that awareness piece is just awareness of your own worldview, your own biases, how you perceive the world, but also awareness and knowledge of the cultural group norms and traditions of the people that you're serving. And you'll get that through consultation with your supervisor if they have a lot of experience with the population, through your training, hopefully, and just dialogue with your clients and cultural bearers when you're the other thing is skills. So skills, you might learn, like today, attending a presentation like this, where I can tell you how I incorporated some of my traditional practices with some evidence-based practice. But so attending trainings, but also once again, like cultural bearer interviews. I know ANTHC does trainings like Doorway to a Sacred Place for people to process trauma. So there's lots out there. All right. The other one is the addressing framework. And the addressing framework really speaks to that awareness aspect, awareness of your own age and generational differences, whether you have a disability or, you know, privilege for not having a disability, religion and spiritual backgrounds, sexual orientation, gender identity, indigeneity and ethnicity, and your socioeconomic status. All of these different things impact therapy from your perspective, but also from their perspective. But they're also intersectional. So there's intersectionality between all of these. I may have privilege in one area, but be oppressed in another area. And so thinking about those things, I have a form using the addressing framework, which is by Pamela Hayes. And I can share that with anybody who wants it, but it's basically just got some question prompts and an area for you to write in. And I try to do this with every client to really understand where they're coming from. And Tlingit people, our tribal members are not monolithic, right? We're all somewhere in this addressing framework. And it's so important to not just treat everybody the same way and expect that they're going to all want to engage in the same way. Okay. So now that part's over, it's like the boring part. We'll talk about my experience so far. The primary evidence-based practice I'm going to talk about today is acceptance and commitment therapy, and how we use that evidence-based practice when we combine it with our Lingít traditional grieving practices, because they go together really well. They have a lot of the same constructs and beliefs behind them and how the process goes. So it was a very good pairing. The one thing that we did to prepare this was my supervisor was like, we need a grief and loss group. Can you help develop one? And so rather than like just starting to develop a grief and loss group from a Western lens, I ended up interviewing a culture bearer. Even though I'm Tlingit and I have gone through all of our traditional grieving practices, I still wanted to have like a deeper understanding of what that process looks like, because I can do a lot of things without really understanding why I'm doing them. And I wanted to understand to help incorporate that into our grief and loss group. And so that's something that I would highly encourage any of you to do if you're trying to culturally make one of your evidence-based practices culturally responsive. And I do want to highlight that everything that we're doing is like surface level cultural practices, right? Like I'm not developing a grounded theory of a new intervention that's like wholly indigenous. And so I'm taking acceptance and commitment therapy and incorporating cultural practices into it. And what this looks like is, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy, but there's 6 areas of what they call the psychological flexibility model. And for me, this one is actually willingness and acceptance. And so what we did is we separated out willingness and acceptance and made it a 8-week program, with the last week being a wholly traditional grieving practice week, rather than combining the two. And so the first week we go into willingness and then acceptance. And you can see how acceptance and commitment therapy would be a good model for grief, because it's something, one of the fundamental theories under acceptance and commitment therapy is that in life there's suffering, and in suffering there's sometimes you can't do anything about it, but just go through it and process it, which is how you experience grief. A lot of the times there's nothing we could do to change that situation. We just have to be with those emotions, be present with them. And when we're not with them, we tend to avoid things that are meaningful to us, this values, and we, don't engage in it. We might ruminate on our grief, or we'll ruminate on what could have been done to prevent that grief. And so acceptance and commitment therapy is really great in that it helps facilitate and heal from that process, helps you recommit to things that are meaningful to you, and also just be able to cope healthily with that grief. Our traditional Tlingit grieving practices do that same thing. And it's just amazing to me that, you know, our ancestors had so much knowledge that they were able to incorporate these beliefs naturally into the grieving process. And so without going into too much detail, because I'm going to go slide by slide what each week looked like, we have things like announcing our loss, to really accept and acknowledge that that loss has occurred, at the same time sharing with others that we need support. But so we blended these two together. Oh, I forgot I had these zoomed in. And once again, you know, just really highlighting that there's culture bearers out there. There's members of the community out there. If it's not, you know, someone that has, it's like a specific culture or spirituality. For example, Meryl and I were talking about the LGBTQ plus community, and that's a community that I, you know, don't have a whole lot of experience with. And so if I were ever to work with someone who is from the LGBT plus community, I would really want to consult with peers or people, community members, to really make sure that I'm providing the best culturally responsive training to that person. So they're out there, you just have to look for them. All right, in week 1, so I mentioned in the psychological flexibility model, willingness and acceptance are together. And how that looks like for acceptance and commitment therapy is we have a discussion about the cost of avoiding your grief. And then from there, just really talking about how we have to switch this mindset to willingness to experience it, so that we can re-engage in the meaningful things that we've been missing out on. And so it's a lot of just building the willingness to expose yourself to that pain. And then for the traditional grieving practices, the first thing that we do is we announce our loss 4 times. And this is something that any of you could do with your clients who's experiencing grief, whether they're Lingít or not, if they're open to it. This is probably the most powerful part of the therapy group, is when people announce their loss 4 times. It's very emotional for everybody. But afterwards, you know, there's like this sense of release. And it's also, you're telling people that you need help and support, and they have these supportive group members there for you. The next thing that we do is called Kwaashk'IKwáan, which is gathering for the smoke. And what we do is we make 3 offerings to a fire, and the spirit within the fire, who's Gundi. And the first offering is to the spirit of the fire to help with like the transference. And then the second offering is for your ancestors. And then the third is for the creator. And what that does is it causes the fire allows this like connection with your ancestors and extra healing and support. But also the smoke goes up into the air, and the whole entire community knows that at that point you're in the Kwaashk'IKwáan. And traditionally people would sit in silence until that fire went out. And then when that fire went out, the opposite clan would come and be there to support you. But we only do 4 minutes of silence, or 8 minutes if there's time, depending on how we're going in that process. And so it can be flexible on the time. But after the 4 minutes of silence, but what that really does is it lets you like be mindful and present with that grief and not avoid it. You're acknowledging it, you're accepting it, but you're also reaching out for support and being mindful and present in a safe way. So the next week is acceptance. And part of this is there's a song in our clan, or at least in Yakutat, I'm not sure if it's specific to my clan, is the paddle song. And the paddle song is not a mourning song, but an acknowledgement song. And what it is used for is when people were out at sea or out on the water, when they would come back, if there was a paddle in the air and that paddle had a crest on it, you knew who had passed away. And while it was up in the air, people would be singing the paddle song. And so we use paired visualization of the participants standing on the beach, whatever beach that they want, and watching their friends and family and the people that were part of this person who passed away, all in the canoe with their paddle up in the air. And we sing the paddle song as that visualization is happening. That's also a really kind of powerful moment for participants. And then after that, the following weeks, we do morning song, which is the drum has lifted. And that's the idea of reciprocity, where the opposite clans, so the other group members, are being the opposite clan for you. And they're providing the empathy and love and support that people need in that time of grief. And so we're really embodying that relationship in that group. And so there's a little bit of education on what that looks like. I found that like 90% of the participants that have been in this program have been pretty impacted by assimilation and have been pretty disconnected from their culture. And this has been, you know, really healing to them to be able to do these cultural practices, especially if like they may be out of state. We do a skills-based one that we don't bill for, and it's not as long. It doesn't have the processing. And a lot of them have been so separate from their culture. It's just like so amazing to them to be able to engage in these cultural practices. So as far as and how are we doing on time? Okay, we're at 12:24. As far as the acceptance piece of acceptance and commitment therapy, there's always some psychoeducation piece. And we do this ball in the pool metaphor and an exercise. There's always a metaphor and an exercise in most of the weeks. Sorry, getting over a cold too. So my voice is a little raspy. In week 3 is mindfulness, and actually acceptance and commitment therapy calls it present moment awareness, which I think is actually a little bit more descriptive of what it actually is, because mindfulness, I've had so many participants or clients think like, oh, I'm being mindful, you know, I'm doing good for others, or I'm like making sure I'm home on time so that, I don't know, my husband's not doing all the work, or, you know, something like that. That's like what people think when we say mindfulness. And so we'll do present moment awareness, and that'll be like the dandelion exercise where you visualize pain in your body or that psychological pain somewhere in your body and breathing into it. And each time you breathe out, a little piece of that dandelion gets blown away. Then we, in the Lingít traditional practices, we do the strength giving robe exercise, which each participant either wraps themselves with their favorite blanket or an article of clothing of the person that they lost, if they have that. And while they have it around them, we sing the Tlingit national anthem, which is Antiyiki's morning song. And it's a song that used to be the national anthem, but a lot of people were misusing it. And so the clan, Lakari, ended up revoking that as the national anthem, but I was able to get special permission to sing that song. I would love to sing it for you guys, but I only have permission to sing it in that context. It is a beautiful song. And you could actually find it on YouTube with the Lakari singing it. But we'll, while they have the blanket wrapped around them, singing the morning song, they visualize their ancestors coming through and healing and providing that love and support through that blanket. And so that's an exercise that we'll do. There is in week 4, we talk about cognitive diffusion, which is basically when you're in grief, you can ruminate on that grief, or you can give yourself rules and expectations like I can't do this anymore because it reminds me of the person that I love, or you feel guilty because that person can't do it with you, or I should have done this, I shouldn't have said this before that person died. So cognitive diffusion really helps separate yourself from those thoughts, or just observe them and not really become fused to them. And when I pick out the evidence-based practice for those, I try to make it as like contextually appropriate to the population. So floating leaves on a moving stream is probably the most popular exercise for that. But the one that we do in this group is boat on the water, because we're Southeast, you know, we live on the water, and a lot of us can imagine being on a boat, you know, subsistence or commercial fishing. And if I do floating leaves, I typically say river and not necessarily stream, just to make it just more environmentally appropriate. And then after, in these following weeks with the Tlingit practices, a lot of it is things that we do at potlatches, sharing stories, telling metaphors, and just being there and supporting each other, like we would do at a Ku'ik potlatch, sharing stories about the loved one. Some people have done poems or art projects and shared that with the group, or even photos. Week 5, self as observer. So we do metaphor, self as observer exercise, which is so similar to cognitive diffusion. You're basically just the person on the person looking down at your thoughts and your existence. But the nice thing about this construct, self as observer, there is a similar one in Tlingit theology of the Tlingit person, and that's Kakina, the spirit above them. And it's like there's this person above you that's not your thoughts, not your feelings, not your emotions, that's separate from you, that you can be. And so it's easy to relate those two concepts together. And then we do morning songs, we share stories. And then in week 6, we start to discuss values. And there's also another part of the Tlingit person called Kwaashk'IKwáan, and that's the person's soul. So we talk about that. And we also talk about like the other parts of a Tlingit person. Ka'ayahi, I think, is there's the name, the person that you're, the likeness, that's the name, that Yaagál for me. And then there's the part that is the emotions, thoughts, and experiences. And I'm trying to blank on what that one is off the top of my head. I'm sure Judy knows. And then we share stories and morning songs. So you can see part of that is a little bit repetitive, but those are things that you can do with your participants. And I'm sure is done a lot in grief and loss work of sharing stories. And maybe it's not a morning song that you can do, but maybe it's a poem, or maybe it's music in popular culture that is really like identifies with someone in their experience. So talk about values, really just kind of talk about what our values are, really identify what that is. And then in week 6, it's having a discussion about what things have we been avoiding meaningful in our life related to our values, and making a plan to recommit to that, and make a coping plan for when we know our grief is going to be activated because we're engaging in these things that we've been avoiding. For Tlingit practices, it's, you know, another metaphor, another story, sharing stories, and morning songs if anyone wants to share.
Hey, Sharnel.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had a question come through. If you have a moment, can you tell us more about the Tlingit conceptualization of a person's soul and how you incorporate that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's I think that one's the Kwaashk'IKwáan. And so in the week that I talk about self as observer, I'll actually talk about all aspects of the Tlingit person, and that's one of them. And then when we're in the values week, we talk more about Kwaashk'IKwáan and what that means. And it's more just using that term when discussing values, like your Kwaashk'IKwáan, like what's important to you, in these values discussions. So it's just providing the education on what it is and then using that term with the other terms of the Tlingit person. I'm not sure if that's helpful. Okay. And then the last week is optional because a lot of these practices that we do, depending on your view of what's appropriate and not appropriate to do in specific settings, because Tlingit people, like Tlingit and Haida, one of their values is adhering to traditions, like strictly. And so that's making sure you're doing appropriate things in the right settings. And it might not be appropriate sometimes. Some people might not see some of these practices as appropriate without doing a full ku'ik. But at the same time, there's people in the lower 48 that will never be able to do a ku'ik. And so being able to help facilitate that for them in a way that's not breaking tradition in my eyes. So when I interviewed the cultural bearer, I asked them, is it appropriate to do this? And they said, yes, because you're doing it in this context. You're not saying it is a ku'ik, and you're not saying like that's what it is. You're providing like this background and understanding of it. And so, whoops. That's important. One thing to, sorry, I got way back there somehow. Important thing to consider too, like what's appropriate and not appropriate to do when you're interviewing your cultural barriers, because you might be doing something that's really taboo and you don't want to do that. But for this one, we actually scheduled this last session separately, and it can be right before dinner time on the weekday or on the weekend, whatever works best for everyone. And we do it right before dinner because at the very end, they have the option to share dinner with people that they're grateful for. And they're making their loved one's favorite food or their favorite food or whatever seems their guest's favorite food, whatever seems appropriate to them. And they engage in all of these exercises. So smudging two fingers of paint on the face, or it could be like black makeup, burning the food ahead of time. So making those, the offering again to Gundi Yegi, and burning the food that you're going to eat before you start eating it. The one thing I forgot to mention with the morning songs is you don't sing all of them until completion, until the end of grieving ceremony. And so at this time, we sing all of the morning songs that we had sung up until this point, but we sing them to completion. And then the end of grieving ceremony is just really letting yourself get emotional, cry openly, and let yourself feel whatever comes up. These are just some quotes that the cultural bearer said, get really loud. The sorrow of a Tlingit man was enough to harden the most sailor. That was something that was in like a Russian written book, because they were like, around during this time of grieving and just really heard the people crying. But you can imagine the catharsis, whatever, you guys know what I'm talking about, that you get when you're able to really feel those feelings. And then it turns over to happiness. And so everyone takes a wet cloth and just wipes the grief away that was on their face, the paint. And then they start sharing positive stories, funny stories of the person that they lost again. And then you eat your food that you've prepped as a group. And that's the last week. Some other things I wanted to mention too is that DBT. So this is the skill that we're going to be doing, is one mindfully, which is a DBT skill. And this is probably how I incorporate culture into DBT the most, is during mindfulness. And one mindfulness is just like, a lot of times you're introducing the concept of mindfulness to participants or clients. They're it's such a hard skill to get. And one mindfulness is like a good introduction, and it's very adaptable to what you can be doing because you're just fully immersing yourself into one thing and you're paying attention to yourself right now in this moment and letting go of any distractions and concentrating your mind. And so some of my sessions were just like trying to make that monkey mind, that part of you that's just always distracted, like really honing that in. And we're doing it through singing song and dance, Tlingit songs, or beading, or, doing something that is a cultural practice that is appropriate, but doing one mindfully. But you can do this with a bunch of different mindfulness practice. This is the easiest to do with you guys today. So we're going to do it. How much time do we got? Okay, I think we have time because I'm only going to sing one song. I also always like to, so one thing to know about Tlingit people, at least I know, is land has such a special connection to us. And no matter who you are, so one thing my dance instructor always told us, you must know who you are, why you are, and where you came from. And that where you came from is such a key piece to your identity. And I've done a lot of like resiliency interviews and some of the research that I've done. And that always comes up with Tlingit people, at least, that there's such a strong connection to the land that even if you don't live in Yakutat or wherever, you can always go back, no matter who's there, no matter what's happening in that community, and just feel so much strength and resiliency being a part of that land. And so during my mindfulness practice, if there's like a song or just a moment of where you're trying to engage in present moment awareness, I like to incorporate videos or pictures of our land. Something to think about if you can get people. So I'm going to just play this video, and I'm going to sing a song called Around the Dish. It's a song that we would use during a potlatch or any type of gathering where you're going to be sharing food. And at the very end of it, we always distribute like smoked salmon, dried fish, seaweed to the elders first, and then to anybody else, where it's still available. But I'm picking it because it's a relatively upbeat song. And while you're listening to it, if you want, you can practice mindfulness. So one thing about mindfulness is, you're just going to be, if we're doing one mindfully, you want to be fully immersed in this moment, listening to the song or looking at the video. You could have your eyes closed, have your eyes open. You can leave your camera on or leave it off, whatever you think is going to make you most comfortable and able to be in that present moment. I always like to start with, taking 3 deep breaths. So, and also, just to warn you, my drum is very tight right now, and it is sounding a little bit pitchy. So just expect that. But go ahead and, just sit comfortably in your seat. Either, you could be lying down, standing, whatever is going to make you feel grounded. But whatever you're doing, making sure that your feet are either planted to the ground or resting in a way that's comfortable. You can have your hands in your lap resting or down by your sides. Make sure your back's supported, your neck's supported. And like I said, you can leave your eyes open or closed. If they are open, make sure you're focusing on one thing and not really looking around the room. That'll help you really stay focused in the moment. So go ahead and take a deep breath in for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. And breathe out for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to do this 2 more times, breathing in. Breathing out. Breathing in. Breathing out. And I lied, we're going to do it one more time. Breathing in. And breathing out. Now go ahead and let your breath breathe itself. Let it come to a rhythm that seems natural. And I'm going to sing the song for you guys. So do your best to just pay attention to what comes up in your mind to this song. You can pay attention to the sounds, the drum, or the video that you see. Oh, he, all right, go ahead and come back. So for everybody that participated or just listened, were you able to stay present in the moment and listen to that song? Anyone willing to share how many times their mind did wander and what thoughts came up? Feel free to unmute too if you just want to talk. I know I hate typing.
I think I was looking at the water, and so I always the water makes me think of life-giving and strength, and so hearing your voice and watching the waves crash on the rocks, it really reminded me that we come from the earth and we're strong and we give life.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Yes, the water is very powerful. I agree. Yeah. Teresa, I see your comment too. I have to admit, mindfulness is something that I struggle with really bad. So the mind wandering, that happens even when people aren't even around me. So I get it. And that's the same with clients. Like it's such a hard skill to really to get down. So doing practices that participants want to do too, you know, is helpful. Like if they want to be engaged in song and dance or a cultural practice that's meaningful to them. Any other thoughts before we get into questions, formal questions? All right. Well, and if you have a thought later, feel free to bring it up during the questions and comments area. So as far as resources, if you're interested in more like cultural competency or working with Alaska Native people more generally, Pamela Hayes, who actually is a psychologist that works in the Nina Wellness Center here in Kenai, she wrote the book Addressing Cultural Complexities, and that's where the addressing framework comes in. She does a lot of examples where she's culturally tailoring her cognitive behavior therapy. And so if CBT is something that you're really familiar with and like to use, that's a great book, great resource. If you haven't already then read it before. You're the Way of the Human Being. It is from a Yupik perspective, and it talks about pre-contact, contact, and post-contact. And that book was life-changing for me, to be honest. I read it in my undergrad, in my first semester, taking Alaska Native Studies or something like that. You know, I'm this Tlingit person from rural Alaska, and it's the first time being exposed to this type of, you know, knowledge. It's kind of sad that, you know, I never understood intergenerational trauma, and that book just like clicked for me. So it was like a pivotal moment in my life and just really understanding historical trauma. So definitely recommend it if you haven't read that. Doorway to a Sacred Place training, ANTHC this actually, I think, was submitted to be a SAMHSA evidence-based practice. I'm not sure if it was selected. Dr. Woods, you would probably know for sure, but it's a training that's in response to trauma and like domestic violence, and it does things like talking circles, how to facilitate a talking circle, and so traditional healing methods. And the last one, it's not necessarily related to Indigenous people, but it's a book, and they have an audio version, which I enjoy. The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down. And then it's about medical providers' experiences working with Hmong populations. But it just paints a really good picture in the harm that could happen from not being culturally responsive or having multicultural competence, and then how you would be more multiculturally competent. So there's some good resources. There's the references from earlier. Now it's just any questions, comments, feedbacks, and I can stop the slide too. Actually, before I do that, here's my information if you need to write it down and want to send an email. I'll actually put that in the.
I'm gonna stop the recording as well. So if that helps anyone